Memories of school discipline often differ considerably depending on where a person grew up, the era in which they attended school, and even the individual teachers who were responsible for maintaining order. Personal recollections can vary greatly, with some former pupils remembering relatively mild discipline, while others recall much harsher experiences. One former pupil reflected on an incident involving a large number of students being questioned following an episode of misconduct. Looking back, they wondered whether the delay in identifying those responsible may simply have been the result of staff carefully eliminating innocent pupils rather than immediately assigning blame. In retrospect, such a process seems more likely than the idea of indiscriminate punishment. It is also worth remembering that practical circumstances often complicated matters. At many secondary schools, particularly those in and around London, games facilities were frequently located some distance from the main buildings. Entire classes could spend an afternoon on sports fields several miles away, making it difficult to account for every pupil at short notice. Schools with extensive sporting programs often relied on both their own playing fields and nearby public facilities. It was not unusual for rugby, football, and athletics to take place away from the school grounds, meaning that some students simply were not present when investigations began. There were also countless everyday reasons why a head teacher might not immediately deal with a disciplinary matter. Scheduled meetings, visitors, governors, or local education authority commitments could all delay proceedings. Looking back decades later, former pupils sometimes add a touch of humour to these memories, joking that perhaps the head teacher needed a moment to prepare before confronting an unruly group of teenagers. When large groups of pupils became involved in misbehaviour, many schools appeared to adopt a fairly predictable approach. Rather than attempting to investigate every individual immediately, attention often focused first on those students who were already well known to the staff. The phrase, "round up the usual suspects," became an expression that many former pupils felt accurately described how some investigations began, even if the intention was simply to establish the facts as quickly as possible. Another recollection concerns a pupil who deliberately accepted a disciplinary punishment rather than allow a female classmate to receive it. Whether motivated by chivalry, youthful bravado, or simply a desire to protect a friend, the incident remained memorable decades later. It also illustrates how school discipline was not always experienced solely as a contest between staff and pupils. Friendships and loyalties frequently influenced how young people reacted when punishment seemed inevitable. Not every punishment, however, was regarded with such generosity. One former pupil remembered arriving late for school because the morning bus had been delayed. Despite explaining the circumstances, the explanation was dismissed without sympathy. The response was blunt. "You should have left home early enough to walk." With that, the punishment was administered. For many pupils, the discomfort was bad enough under normal circumstances, but on freezing winter mornings the experience could be particularly painful. Cold hands and icy weather intensified the sting considerably, leaving an impression that remained vivid many years later. Experiences also varied significantly between different parts of Britain. Rural schools were often remembered as places where formal punishments were used less frequently than in larger towns and cities, although that did not mean they were absent altogether. Former pupils from country districts generally described discipline as being more selective and less routine, with staff often relying on familiarity with individual families and communities. There are also recollections of occasions when entire groups of pupils were punished after breaking school rules during the lunch break. According to these memories, students who had left the school grounds without permission were gathered together before disciplinary action was carried out. Such accounts reflect the emphasis many schools placed upon maintaining order and enforcing boundaries, particularly during the middle decades of the 20th century. In contrast, pupils who attended schools in larger industrial towns often remember a much stricter atmosphere. Discipline was regarded as an integral part of school life, and many former students describe a culture in which punishments were administered regularly and with little hesitation. For those who attended secondary schools during the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, stories of strict discipline form a recurring theme in their recollections, although the frequency and severity varied considerably from one school to another. The teaching staff themselves represented a wide range of personalities and approaches. Most teachers were women, who generally dealt with the day-to-day management of classrooms through firm expectations, consistency, and authority. Alongside them worked a smaller number of male teachers, many of whom occupied senior pastoral, sporting, or administrative roles. Regardless of gender, some teachers earned pupils' respect through fairness and patience, while others became remembered for their uncompromising approach to discipline. Looking back today, many former pupils conclude that where they happened to attend school could make an enormous difference to their educational experience. Differences between regions, individual schools, and even particular teachers meant that no single account can represent every pupil's experience. While some remember discipline as firm but fair, others recall it as unnecessarily harsh. Together, these personal recollections provide a fascinating insight into how attitudes towards school discipline have evolved over the decades, and how educational practices have changed alongside wider social expectations. Lehman, sir, to save that poor girl from painful stinging hands, or were you cheating the system? I was late for school several times because the bus was late. The excuse was not accepted. You should have left home in time to walk here. And the application of the belt followed. Very sore at any time, absolutely excruciating, on really cold hands on a freezing winter's day. You are referring to a rural area where the use of the belt was usually less frequent, although it certainly was still used. It remains on record that, at a school a little north of where you were, over 100 pupils were strapped one afternoon after being found out of the school grounds after the lunch break. The offenders were rounded up, formed into lines, and a team of teachers arrived, belts in their hands, to belt the lot of them. It was in the towns, particularly the industrial ones, that the belt was most often used. You could walk into virtually any Scottish secondary school in the 50s, 60s and 70s, and hear the crack of leather being applied as you walked the corridors. I hope you thanked your parents for arranging to have you born south of the border.